on to our speaker here this morning. We're very lucky to have Dr. James MacLeod here with us. Many of you guys know him. I see many purple UE Aces attire here on. He is very, very well known. Some of you may know him best through his cartoons, which are often go viral online, but are also frequently published by the Evansville Courier and Press. But beyond being a cartoonist and being a world-renowned historian at the University of Evansville, he's also a very good asset for local history here in Evansville. For decades, our universities have done a great job of being plugged into the local community. Across the country, unfortunately, I find that becoming less and less. Professors just don't seem to be tied to their local community. They're there to teach kids, have a job, and often it's nationally focused. I love when there are professors here locally that understand part of the job, part of the calling is to give back to the community through their work. And Dr. MacLeod is a prime example of that. You've got up here 3 examples of books that he's brought to buy. Every single one of these 3 books deals with Evansville. And how fortunate are we to have that kind of scholarship and that history that's giving back to all of us and helping retain something that people in the rest of the country aren't doing. So we need our scholars here locally to help carry the weight for that, and Dr. MacLeod does that. You see some on Lost Evansville. Karl Knecht, who's other than Dr. MacLeod, the best cartoonist known here in Evansville, and Evansville in World War II, which is one of his great specialties. Also have to note, for those of you who don't know him, you might detect a bit of an accent. The longer he's here, I have to say, it seems like it's going away. I don't know how they feel about this, but he's from Scotland. I've found that despite being from Scotland, he's still rooted for England in the World Cup. He has an impeccable choice for hairstyle, I have to say. But he's, like I said, truly a world-class historian, and so I'm so glad and honored that we are able to have him here. Dr. MacLeod.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Thank you. Thank you, Josh, so much for that very gracious introduction, and thank you all for being here. I've been told I can roam between the wall and the edge of this podium and still be on the podcast, so that's what I'll do. So thank you all again for having me here. I knew that Methodist Temple was a pretty woke institution. I didn't know it was so woke that there would be women at the men's breakfast, but I'm really glad to see familiar faces here, and some people who've been friends of mine since long before I came to Evansville, faculty members at U of E who made me feel part of the Evansville family when I was still living in England. So it's wonderful to see you and to see all of you. I hope that those of you at the back can read what's up on the screen. I'll be referring to it a lot. As some of you know, my dad was a minister. I've sat through literally thousands of very long sermons, and I always felt it was really important to have an outline so that you guys know when the end is near. It was always a pretty important part of the experience for me. Anyway, so this is what I'm going to talk about. And the period that I'm covering here is mostly going to be focused on post-World War II Evansville, but some of the story goes back earlier, as you will see. I want to begin, maybe appropriately in this audience, with the words of a clergyman, John Caldwell, who was the first African American elected to the city council in Evansville. If you think about that for a second, Evansville got its beginnings in 1812. The first black person elected to the city council was in 1967. In some ways, the story is told just in that one line. But in 1973, when being interviewed by a truly great local historian, Darrell Bigham, longtime chair of history at USI, in 1973, this is what John Caldwell said, that at heart, Evansville is a racist town. It's a pretty sobering quote, I think, for all of us. And the evidence for that, I think, is very, very clear. These are signs in the possession of the Evansville Museum, signs that you're probably familiar with from textbooks dealing with segregation in the United States, signs that we typically associate with places like Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, the Deep South. And these are signs from Fulton Avenue, Evansville. I spoke at Oakland Library a couple of years ago, and a 78-year-old gentleman came up and talked to me about the three main department stores downtown in Evansville in his youth: Woolworths, Neisner's, and Kresge's. And he recalled the white and colored drinking fountains in all of these stores in downtown Evansville. Lincoln High School teacher Alfred Porter told the story about his wife taking their daughter into Woolworths asking for a drink, and the girl behind the desk saying, "I'll have to check with my manager." Couldn't even give a little black girl a drink in Woolworths. And so the process that we can establish that public facilities were deeply segregated, the process of desegregation was one that was pretty long and difficult. And one of the things I find interesting in doing this research is that the role played by folks who came from outside Evansville into Evansville is really important. John Caldwell himself was from Kentucky, grew up close to Louisville, came here in the 1930s. Another of the really important figures in this story is Willie Effie Thomas, who was from Texas. And she left Texas in the 1940s to get away from segregation. And as she says here, then I found as much here. And I think, again, these simple, short lines are very challenging for all of us. As we think about this city that we call home and that we're so proud to be part of, I don't think we should shy away from this dark aspect of our past, that here's someone coming from literally the Deep South and coming to Evansville in the 40s and finding that it is as segregated here as anywhere that she encountered. So this is Woolworths downtown. So this is Main Street looking south. Here, this photo is taken from just outside the Victory Theater to give you perspective. This building on the corner here is now the new part of Signature School. I actually delivered a version of this lecture in that new part of Signature School, and it was kind of moving, and I think these students were kind of moved to realize that this story here, where she went into the lunch counter in Woolworths, and that lunch counter was along the side of Woolworths that faces what's now the Ford Center. And when she went in, sat down to have a Coke, and when she returned, the waitress said, "I can't serve you. The manager said I'm not supposed to." And if you think about that for a second, what I think is important to realize is that every black woman, every black man, every black kid that had ever walked into Woolworths in Evansville and sat down at that lunch counter had been told to go away. Can't serve you. Not allowed. And they had all, more or less, as far as we know, put up with it. And Willie Effie Thomas, this outsider who'd come in, this little woman who'd come into Evansville as a newcomer, decided that she wasn't going to put up with it. And so, as it says here, she responded by getting people together to stage a sit-in, and then later organized stand-up protests in theaters where blacks were confined to just sitting at the very back or the back of the upper level in some cases. So Willie Effie Thomas is a really important part of this story. Second part of the story of this public facilities is swimming pools. And again, this was something that is maybe logical, but maybe not surprising to you, but swimming pools were among the most deeply fought or bitterly fought over public spaces in the United States when it came to desegregation. For some reason, white people objected more strongly to the mixing of races at swimming pools than almost anywhere else. You can probably speculate why that is. Maybe it's because swimming pools are mostly full of young people. They're mostly in a state of undress. And who knows what's going to happen if black kids and white kids get together in a swimming pool. But they were deeply fought over. This quote here from Marion, Indiana: whites didn't want to swim with blacks because, quote, they didn't want to be polluted by their blackness, unquote. That was a resident of Marion said that. So in Evansville, there were 5 public pools in the 1950s, and they were segregated. 4 of these pools were for white people only, and 1 pool, this one, Miller Pool, I've got a pointer here, but I'm willing to bet it doesn't work on the screen. It doesn't, but the diagonal running left, bottom left to top right here is Canal Street, and then the other side of that triangle is Lincoln Avenue. So this is Lincoln Avenue here. This is Governor, and that was where Miller Pool was, and Miller was for black people only. So all the other pools in Evansville, including Ortiz Pool, which is further north of this part of Evansville, were for whites only. In 1956, in June of 1956, a minister named Arthur Jelks, who was another incomer to the city, Arthur Jelks and some other ministers, you see that ministers are often the ringleaders of political and social trouble, which is, I think, really good to know. You guys need to keep that in mind. And he led a group of students to Ortiz, black students to Ortiz Pool, and asked to swim. What I want to point out real fast here is that by 1956, it was actually illegal for Evansville to have segregated pools. The federal government had made decisions that made it illegal to segregate public facilities run by the city. But the status quo in Evansville was that segregation was maintained. And so when they showed up at Ortiz Pool, the head lifeguard, who was himself just a kid at Wrights High School, said, "We can't have you in here." And they responded by suing, on behalf of these 33 kids, they sued the city about this. And when you look at the documents related to these lawsuits, they're kind of funny because they sued the city of Evansville and every official they could think of. So it's a long list of city officials who got sued for this. And the ringleader of the lawsuit was a man called Sidney Berger. And the name Berger is pretty well known in the city. Berger and Berger Law Company. Charlie Berger, I'm sure many of you know, and friend of many of you, the son of Sidney Berger, still causing good trouble in the city. But Sidney himself, also an incomer from the East Coast originally, moved from St. Louis to Evansville, Jewish, and a labor and civil rights lawyer. And he sued on behalf of these kids, and within 3 days, they had won. And this wonderful headline, this is actually a newspaper cutting from Sidney Berger's own scrapbook. So he lost many battles, but the ones he won, I'm sure you can identify with it, Josh. The battles he won, he wanted to remember, and he put in his scrapbook. So segregation ended in recreation. City pools opened to Negroes. And one of the things that I think is funny is that the story that describes one of the pools where black kids and white kids were swimming together just mentioned that they lined up quietly together to take turns jumping off the diving board. So all these people who had thought that the world would come to an end if black kids and white kids swam together woke up the next morning, and you know what? Nothing happened. So that was a kind of a happy ending to that part of the story. The next kind of big part of the story of desegregation in Evansville relates to housing. And so if I go back here for a moment, Evansville by 1900, over 50% of the black population lived in this area here on this map. And again, I wish, I don't think I put the, let me just see. Yeah, here we go. So that's just a lighter version of that map. So you can see the Lloyd is across the top, Governor and Garvin, Canal and Lincoln. Let me scoot back there for a second. So this is where about 50% of the black population lived. There were pockets of black population in other parts of the city. Some of you who grew up in other parts of the city might say, well, you know, we knew black people around the corner from us. I'm not saying that everybody lived in this area, but this is where black people were concentrated. The corner of Lincoln and Governor was considered to be the heart of this. In fact, someone who was a teacher at Harrison in the early 70s, when black kids started coming into Harrison High School for the first time, he said that the part of the high school where black kids hung out was referred to as Lincoln and Governor. So that was almost shorthand in the city for Black Evansville. And what I think is kind of fascinating about this is so 1900, as we saw in that quote, this is where black people lived. This is 1925, according to the census. That's where black people live, Baptist town, for the most part. This is the 2018 census. That's where most black people in Evansville live today. And so, while this is a story of desegregation, and it's a story of progress, and it's a story of us moving from one part of our history to another, it's also really striking, is it not, that so much of this stuff is still true. And I can go and talk to a black church where the audience is 90% black, and I can come and talk to you all, and you look around here, and it kind of speaks for itself, right? We are still a deeply segregated society where people live in specific places, and they worship in specific places, and they don't really see each other all that much. So one of the things I would always kind of want to end a talk like this, and I shouldn't use the word end because that's you're all sort of excitedly looking at me now. Still got ways to go, but I always want to emphasize that although we have come so far, we have much of this journey still to take. So this is what black housing looked like in 1957 in this area. That is literally the corner of Lincoln and Governor right there. And Reverend Charles King, another of the great figures in this story, yet another outsider who came in and caused trouble, said, and this is a 1966 article in the Courier, I live in a ghetto, an invisible wall. This spacing is not ours. It is determined largely by the unwritten code of racial prejudice. So, why do I live in a ghetto if I am Charles King? He says this is not our choice. It is because of the unwritten code of racial prejudice. Why is this breakfast so predominantly Caucasian? The unwritten code of racial prejudice. I think it's probably here, as it is in my classrooms at UE, which are overwhelmingly white, despite the fact that UE is located so close to Baptistown, so close to Bosse High School. My classrooms, for the most part, look like you. If there's black faces in my class, more often than not, they're African as opposed to African American. The unwritten code of racial prejudice. So Caldwell, in that same 73 interview, said the Evansville realtors had a gentleman's agreement that they wouldn't sell to Negroes in certain sections. So you could negotiate to buy a house, and then when you show up and the realtor sees what you actually look like, suddenly the house is sold. A story that is common all across the so-called North. But as well as an unwritten code, there's also a written code to amplify this. And as an exercise, I would encourage all of you who live in Evansville to go look at the covenants on the house that you own, if you own a house. And I'm willing to bet if you go back a few pages in that covenant, you'll come across stuff that looks a lot like this. So this is Rotherwood, just round the corner from us. And item number 4 on that list, said property in no part thereof shall ever be owned or occupied by Negroes or Asiatics. My first property in Evansville was on Baird Park Drive, and a few pages back in the covenant, there was wording that was very similar to this. This is Capital Elms. No property shall be rented, leased, contracted to, or conveyed to any other than those of the Caucasian race. So I've got lots of examples of that in my book, and lots of the neighborhoods. A lot of these neighborhoods around here were built in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Kind of as you move further east, the date rises, and all of these places would have had covenants just like that. So there's a long legal process fought in cities all over the north, all over Indiana, and also here in Evansville over the course of the 60s to get an equal housing ordinance. And finally, with great difficulty, this was passed. And so this is the Evansville Press, tough open housing ordinance made official by city council. So it was now illegal, according to the city, to base your rental agreements or sales agreements on race. Now, I would definitely acknowledge at this point that the legislation is there. It takes real effort to then make that reality. And various organizations and individuals fought hard over the next 60 years to make this reality true. But I want to focus just for a second on this photo. It's a wonderful photo from the front page of the press. So that's the photo there. This is that photo enhanced slightly by the dreaded AI. But among others in this picture, left to right, Major Alston, Bill Butterfield, Ira Neal, and Sidney Berger. And I really love this photo because, number one, there's relatively few photos of the civil rights movement in Evansville. We have that photo of the kids showing up at RT's pool. We have this photo. There's a couple of others. But most of this stuff, as far as I can tell, went unphotographed, which is too bad, right? Because you think of the images of the civil rights movement, of the people getting ketchup poured on their heads, sitting at lunch counters and stuff like that. We just don't have pictures of Willie Effie Thomas saying no. We don't have pictures of Willie Effie Thomas standing up in a theater. But we do have this picture. And so you have a black Baptist minister, a white Protestant activist, a black teacher, and a white Jewish activist in this picture. It's the kind of rainbow coalition of the people that fought for civil rights in our community. And I think we should feel very proud of that. Just incidentally, Sidney Berger on the right, as you can maybe imagine, was Sidney Berger's wife. And Sidney Berger was also a labor rights and civil rights activist. And Charlie has talked to me very movingly of how persecuted his parents were in this city for fighting for the causes that they fought for. They were called pinkos and communists. Sidney was identified as a member of the Communist Party at a meeting of one of the witch hunt committees that met in Evansville in 1948. A congressional committee met in Evansville in 1948, and she was formally named as a member of the Communist Party, even though she wasn't. So name and address in the paper and everything. So great cost to fighting for what you believe in. But I kind of love this picture, young and old in here as well, men and women, the people who were fighting for what they believed in. And who was the person that moved the motion to have the housing ordinance? None other than John Caldwell, the first black person elected to the city council. He made the final motion to adopt the ordinance that night. And he said it was one of the high points of his political career. So we've talked about public facilities. We've talked about housing. I want to talk here a little bit about schools, and I think it's a really pretty important part of the story. And maybe surprising to all of us is the fact that Indiana was ahead of the curve when it came to desegregating schools. Indiana actually made it illegal to segregate schools in 1949. So 5 years before the first Brown v. Board of Education decision that led to the desegregation of schools nationally, conservative Indiana had gone ahead and done that itself. And so the first integration of schools in Evansville happened in the early 1950s. And the first place that was desegregated was Harwood School in 1954. And again, one of the few photos that we have is this one here, and isn't it wonderful? A little white kid walking hand in hand with a bunch of black kids. And the caption on the story, shortly before 3 p.m., a group of Negro and white children left their classrooms, hand in hand and arm, headed for home. The pupils played together during recess and during the noon hour, unaware of either race or color. Oh, isn't that nice? And again, as a historian, one of the things that I try to emphasize to students, and we've got great history teachers in this audience, one of the things I try to emphasize to them is that everything we know as historians is based on available sources. And we have to use what we have. And sometimes that tells us exactly what happened. Sometimes it only tells us part of what happened. If the only picture you had of the integration of Harwood School was this one, we could comfortably conclude that our ancestors here in Evansville were cool people, and when desegregation came to the schools, they sent their kids off and were happy to see them cavort across the playground hand in hand and arm in arm. And we should all give ourselves a pat on the back. Unfortunately, the press also carried another photograph that day. A second photo showing the parents on the other side of the street protesting against the desegregation of Harwood School. They had signs that said, "You have your school, we have ours. Go back to your own schools, and we are against integration." I don't know what integration is, but they were against it, whatever it was. I don't want my child to go to school with Negro children, and the wonderful logical argument, I didn't go to school with Negroes, so why should my children? So one of the things that I would just point out to you is that if that was the only photo we had of the desegregation of Harwood School, we would conclude that our ancestors were racist and biased and objected to children playing together in playgrounds and all of that. And of course, we're lucky in this case that we have both photos. And we know that it was a bit of both, as is so often the case in history. So all the way, despite the fact that desegregation began in 1954 in Evansville, it was incredibly slow. And right into the 1960s, black kids from surrounding areas were bused into Evansville to go to Lincoln School, so that all white schools could be maintained outside in places like Boonville, Yankeetown, and Rockport. So I think that one of the things that's interesting about that is that white people complained like crazy, as you all know, and as many of you maybe remember, in the 1970s about busing. And this idea that white kids were being bused across town practically tore northern cities apart, right? Boston famously tore itself apart over busing. White kids being put on buses. Whereas here, for years, black kids had been put on buses and bused into Evansville to go to an all-black school so that all white schools could be maintained in some of these places. Some of these places are still deeply segregated. Some of these places still have a pretty racist tale to tell. I've talked to some pretty young people who played high school sports in this part of the world in the 1980s and tell stories about going to some places and encountering racist messaging in these communities, for example. So eventually this idea that, 1949, Indiana makes desegregation or makes segregation illegal in schools. 54, Brown v. Board of Education makes it illegal effectively across the country. But by the late 1960s, Evansville still basically has a segregated school system. And the EVSC dragging its feet. And finally, in the late 60s, the federal government says, you have to do this or else. And so what they come up with in December 1969 is what was famously called the Pie Plan. You can tell what a big deal this is. This is the entire front page of the Evansville Press. Think about that for a second. The assassination of John F. Kennedy didn't get the entire front page of the press. Landing on the moon didn't get the entire front page of the press. But the new pie plan did. And what the pie plan, I always ask people if they understand how pies work, and then provide this helpful diagram right here. So basically slicing the Evansville-Vanderburg School Corporation into 5 slices, each of which pertains to one or other of the 5 public high schools in town. And you can see here, maybe the word gerrymander creeps into your mind. What you're trying to do is divide up the black population, so there's roughly 1/5 of the black population in each of the school districts. And so Central, Wrights, North, Bosse, and Harrison have their own catchment area, and that catchment area goes all the way into the very middle. And this is a little bit crude, but that's roughly what it looks like in terms of the 5 schools. And so, again, it seems to me important to emphasize, it might be blindingly obvious, but this is pretty traumatic for the people that live inside this oval right here. The way I talk about this in my book, and the way I've always, or had always talked about this, was as something very positive. That the desegregation of schools is a good thing. And having black and white kids holding hands in the schoolyard is a good thing. But what I've learned over the last 4 years or so, talking to black people in Evansville and other parts of the country actually, is that the desegregation of schools was a gigantic trauma for these kids. Can you imagine being the black kids that got on a bus from this part of Evansville and had to go to the dark wastes of Wrights Hill and walk into Wrights High School for the first time? To head out to the far east side of Evansville to the new Harrison High School and walk in there. Some of you might have been at this event where there was an event downtown at the library maybe 2 years ago, and a couple of gentlemen and a couple of ladies in their mid to late 60s, maybe 70 years old, roughly about that, talked about being in that first class of black kids. There was a handful of black kids at Harrison already. I understand that. But the first kids who were bused into Harrison had an immensely traumatic experience. For the first weeks of their time there, they sat in the cafeteria because, quote unquote, their papers hadn't arrived, their records hadn't arrived. They were verbally abused in the halls when they walked the halls. They were called the N-word every single day. One of these men, so let's say he was 70 years old, one of these men had tears in his eyes, a voice shaking as he talked about that experience. And it became really clear to me that that experience that they underwent in the early 70s stayed with them for the rest of their lives. It was an immensely difficult thing. My friend Watez Phelps pointed out to me that in some of these areas, all of these kids had gone to grade school together, and now suddenly, literally, a kid on one side of the street was going to Bosse, and a kid on the other side of the street was getting on a bus and going to Wrights, or getting on a bus and going to North. And it really, in some ways, ripped the heart out of that community and made things immensely difficult for them. And as I detail in that chapter, it's about maybe more than a quarter of my book actually deals with all of this stuff about civil rights. All 5 of Evansville's high schools saw a lot of physical violence in the early 70s during this period. It was an immensely difficult period for everybody. So you think about the pie plan and you think, well, that was 1969. What I think is really interesting is that this is what the EVSC looks like today. The pie is basically exactly the same. I live on the north side near the airport. My kids went to North Junior High. North Junior High's got a lot of black kids in it. These black kids don't live on the north side. Most of them live where their great-grandparents lived, down in the center of Evansville. They get on a bus and they ride up to North. They get on buses and they ride to Harrison. they get on buses and they ride to rights still today. Perry Heights, I mistakenly left this slide up on here. I was talking at Perry Heights. Perry Heights Middle School, which feeds rights, does have a pretty significant black population. So it's one of the places outside of Baptistown where black kids were. And when I first did a presentation like this at Perry Heights Middle School, for one thing, it was the last day before Christmas. The kids are all wearing pajamas, and I'm the last thing between them and their Christmas break. Can you imagine that? Yeah. So there was this one black kid who was right in my line of vision, and she sat there scowling at me furiously through this whole presentation. And when I asked at the end, are there any questions, I was delighted to see dozens of hands go up and horrified to see that the highest hand was this kid right here. And I picked her first. I thought, might as well get this over with. And she said, why did they hate us so much? And I thought that was a stunning question, incredibly powerful question. And I stumbled and tried to answer. It's really an unanswerable question. The second question was, is the Loch Ness Monster real? Yeah, that was much easier question to answer. So, as in my dad's sermons, so here, the happiest word that you see is this one here. What I want to just quickly say here is this. When John Caldwell moved to Evansville in the late 1920s, Evansville was coming out of a period where it had been dominated by the Ku Klux Klan. If you look in the Evansville newspapers at that time, people are proud to be members of the Klan. The political class is dominated by Klan members. The newspapers ran full-page ads for Klan meetings at the Coliseum, which is the biggest public space in the city. And from 1926 to 1930, Herbert Mayles, the mayor, who won in a landslide, was an open member of the KKK. And if you go into the Civic Center today, outside the mayor's office, is this wall of photos of Evansville mayors. And right in the middle of it is a member of the KKK. But as Amanda Day took this photo, we have a black female mayor today. In some ways, I think this is a pretty powerful symbol of how far we have come. Herbert Mayles grinning at her right there from the middle. And I will leave you with this quote here from John Caldwell. And I think it's a really important message, whether you're a 14-year-old kid at Perry Heights or someone of an older age than that at Methodist Temple men's and women's breakfast. I can't stand discrimination and injustice. I mean, it just grates me through and through. And whenever I see it, I feel like doing something about it, and then I'm not afraid. Whenever I see it, I feel like doing something about it. And my wish for you and me and all of us is that that is the emotion that we have when we look out at the world around us today. We see what is wrong with it, and we feel that we want to do something about it. John Caldwell was not afraid. I am frequently afraid. There's no guarantee that you won't be afraid, but I feel that we all have a need, a desire, an injunction when we see something is wrong to feel that you need to do something about it. Thank you all very much indeed.